Welcome to Prepared Leader, From Crisis to Confidence, the podcast for leaders who understand that disruption isn't an interruption to leadership, it's a moment leadership is revealed. I'm Helen Lipscomb, and each month we explore how resilient leaders prepare before pressure hits. So when it does, they don't just react, they respond with clarity and confidence. Today's conversation starts with a simple but uncomfortable truth. When a story breaks, organizations don't lose control because of what happened. They lose control because they never decided who they wanted to be when it did. PR readiness isn't about spin, it's about trust, about identity, and it's about whether your people know what they're defending when the spotlight turns on them. To explore this, I'm joined by Sarah Henderson, founder of Purely PR Public Relations, to discuss what resilient communication really looks like before, during, and after a reputational moment. Sarah is the founder and managing director of Purely Public Relations. She's worked across agency and in-house roles, supporting high-profile brands and complex organizations, often when the pressure is highest and the margin for error is the smallest. Today, Sarah helps leaders build communications that don't just protect reputation, but actively reinforce trust, internally and externally. Sarah, thank you for joining us on the Prepared Leader. We're really excited to talk to you and hear a bit about your expertise.
Thanks, Helen. Lovely to see you.
I think it'd be great just to start with, if you could just give us a little bit of, I guess, what drew you to PR? What is it about this work that kind of makes you focus more on that trust and that engagement for your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks very much. So, yeah, I kind of always was really interested in how the media worked. So, I was one of those kids that really loved seeing how TV programs got made and how newspapers got put together and magazines. So, I used to love watching all those kind of behind the scenes type, like, snapshots of how things are done. And I think that's what got me interested initially. So I decided when I was sort of studying my GCSEs that I wanted to become a journalist, actually.
Oh,
So I remember going to like a college open day, and they had somebody representing sort of the media A-level department. And I'm pretty sure the local paper was there. And I remember sort of saying, quite proudly that I wanted to become a journalist. And they kind of told me, rightly or wrongly, sort of what the sort of maybe the downfalls were of being a journalist.
okay.
And what was quite interesting was sort of back then, and I know sort of the media has sort of moved on quite a lot, but if I'm quite old now, sadly. And so this is the 90s then. And so I suppose reporting back then within the media point of view was quite different to what it is now.
Hmm.
And I think I learnt at that time, and therefore the people that I suppose were representing that industry, that you needed to be a certain type of personality to be a journalist. And I was quite a shy kid. I'm still a bit now. And I just worried that I wasn't actually going to be able to kind of deliver in a kind of quite cutthroat industry. I wanted to work for a national newspaper, and was sort of the initial thought. And I just realized maybe that wasn't for me. So I tried to think of what could I do that sort of met in the middle type thing,
Right.
and
Okay.
still kind of got my interest going. And I don't really know how I necessarily got introduced to PR, but I knew it as a bit of a buzzword. I suppose back then, probably the most famous publicist was Max Clifford. And I
Mm.
remember reading about him and being quite intrigued about it. And then Absolutely Fabulous was obviously quite a famous sitcom in the 90s.
Yes.
And that didn't bring me in, but I remember thinking, oh, this is just a bit of a funny industry. I want to find out a bit more about it. And yeah, I decided to do a PR degree. Actually, they actually used to offer a
Oh,
public relations degree at university. There was about 8 different universities across the UK that did it. And it was one of those degree courses that allowed you to do, it was really varied. So we did economics, finance, law, politics, strategy work, writing work. So I loved it because it was had so much variety in it.
mm,
And I became a bit of an all-rounder, and then worked in PR ever since.
interesting. Interesting. Because I think there's so much in that, but I think that the concept of kind of, I guess, what PR is a really interesting point, because there's some very clear examples in terms of Max Clifford and Ab Fab, which is very glossy,
Exactly.
very much about the, I guess, the sales pitch side more than maybe some of the, well, a lot of the hard work that will go on behind that. What do you think leaders see PR as? Do they see that something that is about preparing their organization, getting their organization ready?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, let's burst this bubble straight away. Like PR is definitely not what it was ever perceived on Absolutely Fabulous or any other TV programs since
No.
Sex in the City or any of these other programs.
Mm.
It's not glamorous in the slightest, and it's not well paid at times either. So, yeah, I think maybe leaders, and I still had it a bit as of fairly recent times, is I think PR is still seen as a bit of a luxury for an
Interesting.
organization, and um, it's not always seen as a priority when they perhaps want to invest in other areas.
Mhm.
And obviously, my experience has always been, and of course, I'm biased, but you absolutely have to invest in this area.
Mm.
And especially from the topic that we're talking about today, you absolutely need to prepare for the unexpected. And things do go wrong so much more nowadays than they ever
Yeah.
did before. I think a lot of my work quite often is about educating people, especially in that senior management kind of area, about why it's so important to one have either a PR consultant or PR agency support, or have a in-house department
Mm.
within your organization, and to make sure that they're sat around the table around with everyone else who's a relevant department that should be there. Like, don't forget about your PR and comms person, because
Yeah.
they're the one that's going to be on the cold face when things go wrong.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's a really kind of good way of almost explaining it, is this is about preparing yourself, preparing your organization. It is about being ahead of it. As I sort of started with the introduction, this is where organizations can often not think ahead of, how do we want to be seen? What are those messages that we want to get out there? And as you said, disruptions are happening more and more. And with the way that media has changed, it is very easy to lose your voice in that. And it's very easy not to be able to own that narrative and kind of be, this is our problem, this is what we're doing about it, and we are taking ownership in the right way, not to take responsibility if unless necessary, but taking ownership, and we are the authority around this, which I
Yeah,
think is really
absolutely.
important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think lots of people think about PR as that promotional bit,
Mm.
about that sort of proactive bit. And of course, there is an element of that. And of course, there's that traditional media relations bit that everyone, I suppose, knows most famously that PR is about. But I think probably what people forget, and I would say this is probably at least 50% of my job, it is that protection
Yeah.
reactive bit. It actually takes up far more of your time than you think it would do, and so that's why you should be ready, and that's
Mm.
why people should invest in it, because you're probably going to be doing far more of that protection reaction bit than you ever thought you would ever do.
Yeah.
And especially as we've sort of alluded to earlier, it's absolutely going to happen. Like, I can guarantee you're going to have a problem within a business's lifetime. Like, no one's ever going to get off scot-free anymore. Whereas before, maybe before social media emerged, and before we were in such an uncertain world and the media landscape was different, I would probably say it was less likely.
Yeah.
But now anyone's going to get affected now, which is the scary thing.
Exactly that. And that element, as you say, of it, maybe smaller organizations probably previously would have said, this is something that we don't have to prepare for, that we don't have to plan for, because it's more likely that those big organizations are going to be the ones the media will be attracted to and be interested in. But it is much wider
Yeah.
in terms of that scope. And it is also just, again, back to, events are happening all the time. organizations are having to deal with just a level of uncertainty that is never been seen before. And whether it's power outages, whether it's cyber, whether it's civil disruption, or any of those different things, these are all risks that organizations need to be thinking about. Well, what does this mean for us?
Yeah.
And what would we want to communicate if we were impacted by these events? And how do we, again, plan for that now? Do you think, I suppose, where do you think the organizations are maybe missing the point on this, or undermining themselves when it comes to resilience communications?
Similar to what I sort of alluded to earlier, I think the first point is they don't prepare anything at all. So
Mm,
therefore, a lack of preparation is always going to put you on the back foot
yeah,
straight away.
yeah,
I think the second point is some organisations do invest in preparation, which is brilliant and it's really admirable, and they absolutely should continue to do that. But the problem sometimes lies is that the comms team get forgotten and don't get invited to
yeah,
those meetings or those wash up meetings, etc. They quite often will think about the lawyers and the legal team, which is obviously absolutely key. They need to be involved, but they forget about the comms side of it. And
mm,
as I mentioned, sadly, it's actually the comms team are the people that are the ones that are front facing. We'll do our absolute best not to get the chief exec or the directors or anything like that involved. We'll be that sort of like protector for
mm,
you. But the downside of that is we need to have all the up to date information to hand and all the facts and stats and things to be able to do that. When we're not invited to that, that's really tricky, because things are so fast moving. You've got to be involved. And I think probably the last thing is sort of investing in sort of like systems, I would say, is probably the other thing. So there are lots of companies out there now that can offer things like social media listening
yeah,
and very sort of planning type tools. I do think, especially if you're an organization that's got some budget and you don't want to have a break in your business being affected by a serious issue, I would always justify that it's probably worth looking into getting those kind of suppliers on board to help you, because not only can it sort of horizon scan almost for you, so it can help maybe check out like an issue that might be coming down the line or a trend or something like that. But I
mm,
think it can also spot some opportunities for you as well. So if a competitor, for example, was having a really bad time,
yeah,
and not that I would ever say, you want to benefit from someone else's misfortune per se, but um, there are opportunities sometimes to be able to show that your business is also available to help if another business is offline for whatever
yeah,
reason.
yeah,
So I think those are probably the kind of the key takeaways I would initially say is really
mm,
important for businesses of any shape or size to be aware of.
yeah. I think that's really important. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about that was around, again, if communications, if PR are not in the room, then that risk of misalignment around around the message is so key. And it also comes to mind when you think about, who is in the room. So legal being in there and then being very protective of what you can say, but not feeling confident about that. And actually, any disruption that's happening, you've got people at the end of it, and people want to know, and not in a, um, I want to hold you account. It's just, I want to understand what's happening. I want to understand what the situation is. I want to understand what you're doing about it. And again, to me, that sort of speaks to the way I'd be looking about this is ultimately we are dealing with people all the time. And we need to keep that at the center of how we plan our processes and how we design our response structures, our messaging, all of that. I guess, how do you see some of that working, and where have you seen those challenges for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. All really good points. And I think, from a comms point of view, like the comms team and the legal team need to be best friends,
Mm,
first off.
yeah.
And also you need to absolutely get the decision makers within the business to sort of sign off on basically what it is that needs to be communicated like as quickly as possible. I think when comms aren't around the table, things can get signed off that sound, a bit to your point, less about the person or the people that are affected. It sounds quite jargony, quite corporate
Yeah.
speak, and perhaps doesn't, explain things in a way that kind of means that you're kind of on top of whatever it is. You know, I would always kind of advocate for, if you need to communicate, to try and rid of some of that stuff, so that it feels like it talks to all different kinds of stakeholders, because
Mhm.
ultimately you don't really want to keep changing the message to suit a
Yeah.
different type of stakeholder. You need sort of one aligned message that will speak to your suppliers, your customers, and your staff, MPs or policymakers, whoever are your stakeholders really in the media. Obviously, if you can create something that has a kind of one sort of like narrative, then that's an absolute bonus. And I think also connected to that point is, you need to persuade then whoever's around that table to make sure that you're communicating with your staff as well, because I think staff get quite often forgotten about. They'll think about the obvious ones, like the media, or let's put something out on social media or something like that. But actually it's your staff that are also having to deal with inquiries coming in, whether that's from like a supplier or a partner or customers, obviously. And so, don't forget that as a comms channel as
Yeah.
well, because yeah, they need that information just as much as a journalist does. So
That's a really good point. And I think, again, that to me is that element of one, knowing who you need to communicate, but you're absolutely right. Not if when people do forget staff, then you end up with some more misaligned communications, because they will hear messages, they will hear things, and it's then knowing what they can share, knowing what's appropriate, which is part of that communication. It's part of the, we're telling you this, but we're telling you this as trusted employees. We're telling you, you may share the same message, but you may share more. But there's a part of that's that relationship, that's that connection that we want you to feel part of the problem, but also part of the solution. And I think that's a really important thing to do, because what I have seen, and I'm sure you've got examples of, when employees aren't connected to this, they will potentially send a different message out, and they will share the bits that they picked up, because organizations are always talking. This is not something you can control, but that could be miscommunication. That will be snippets of information. And again, that is that element of, once it's out there in the public domain, how do you then kind of bring that back together in a coherent, consistent way? Which I really like your point about, it's not about different messages to different stakeholder group. It's the same message, but being consistent around that and being ready to share whatever you can at the right time is really important.
absolutely. And I think what you have to be really careful when you're communicating to your staff is, ideally you want to try and keep that message as close to the external message as possible,
Mm.
because to your point, as soon as there's a differentiator between the two, then not only does it become quite confusing, because people are thinking, oh gosh, which bit's the truth, which bit's the correct bit.
Yeah.
But if you've got maybe a slightly disgruntled staff member who decides to go a bit rogue, and they then, I don't know, post it out on social media, or they've got a mate that works at the local paper or
Hmm.
whatever.
Hmm.
And I've definitely been in those scenarios where things have been leaked before, and it makes things so much harder.
Yeah.
So it's always best to try and make sure that it is absolutely as aligned as possible. And with the thought that the CEO needs to be aware that if by chance this got leaked, they'd be happy with it being
Yes.
leaked.
Yeah.
Happy is in inverted commas,
Yeah.
obviously. But,
Yeah.
but it wouldn't be the end of the world if it got
No.
leaked. So I think always, when it comes to drafting, always have that in your front of mind, that you're potentially happy for it to be leaked, because
Hmm.
it's not going to cause you too much drama if it does.
Yes. Again, I think that's a really good point, because that should be the mindset that is being applied. Is once you share it, it is public knowledge. Even if you are thinking, I'm sharing it internally, there's no guarantees around that. Are there any other things that you would think maybe are kind of almost heading towards non-negotiables that that organizations, if they either are reviewing crisis communications, PR preparedness, or haven't got anything in place right now and listening to this, that they should be starting to develop and have in place?
Yeah, I would always say, if you can, start investing in what I would call a crisis comms handbook. And actually, even maybe before you get to that stage, I would also suggest that you have, at least if you could do, like bi-monthly or quarterly meetings with all the right people
Hmm.
representing a different department within your organization, where you come together to, I would say, horizon scan, basically. So what are the things that potentially could impact the industry that we work in? What are things that we're seeing that are being talked about by our customers, by our suppliers, by the media? And I would almost create a bit of a RAG system where you rate it red, amber, green on what are the likelihood that this could come and bite us on the bum, basically, at some point later down the track. So I think getting to know different people across different departments, understanding what their roles and responsibilities are within their respective areas, I think is super important.
Hmm.
And then within that comes basically this crisis comms handbook, where I would say it's a mixture of all different types of chapters. So I suppose it would ultimately have lots of different contact lists on there and the roles and responsibilities of who's a member of this group.
Yeah.
It would also have a bit of a flowchart on process. What makes a crisis, I suppose, move to something quite serious? So maybe you rate it gold, silver, bronze, however you want to do it.
Yeah.
And then if you can, and again, this is always a bit tricky when you don't know exactly what scenario you're going to be given, is try and draft the materials in advance if you can.
Mm.
So get the maybe the bare bones of what a social media post would look like. What would a media statement look like? What would an internal comms note to your staff look like? A customer letter, a supplier letter, that kind of stuff. So that
Mm.
when it does hit, you are sort of halfway there already. And just constantly maintain this handbook. So whenever you're meeting, say quarterly or bi-monthly, you as a
Yeah.
group then review it, keep evolving it so that again, it's a useful document for lots of different people.
And it was really good. I mean, your point about the draft communication is one that I certainly, with some of my clients, have that challenging conversation, I'd say a little bit. And I think it is exactly as you say, it's they know there's your plan. They know that they need something in place. And they will go through that having some level of a handbook, some level of clear requirements, clear expectations. But when it comes to just that final step of let's have something drafted, they sort of just stop at that point and go, well, we've got a plan, we've got something in place. Yet the conversations then I will have with them was, well, we don't quite know what the sign off process is, but we know it will take a while. And that's where I sort of almost want to scream at them and go, but you haven't got a while, or whatever a while means, because that's always a difficult question. There isn't that time. So what can you do now? What is the plan that you can put in place that at least means you're a little bit more prepared, and some of the language is at least agreed, because then yes, the specifics of the event can be put in, but everyone has seen a draft previously. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think people always forget how long approvals take. So I think, yeah, anything you can do to try and get a bit of the grunt work done in
Yeah.
advance. Of course, you're always going to need to check in with the right people when the scenario actually happens. Like you
Mhm.
can't take verbatim that that is it signed off. There's
Yeah.
only ever probably one example where I was dealing with on a royal death. So one
Okay.
particular retail organisation that I work with, they had a warrant, a royal warrant, and so there were certain processes that we needed to do as and when the Queen died or the Duke of
Hmm.
Edinburgh died, etc. So that was probably the only scenario that I can really think of, is once we'd got it signed off by various different stakeholders, that was actually the message that we were going to use, and
Right.
really didn't have to change hardly anything.
Sure.
Um, but that's a rare rare
Yes.
example. I think,
Yeah.
yeah, so you absolutely still need to go through a proper approval process, but hopefully
Yeah.
you've done most of the work before.
Exactly. And I think again, I suppose is there any, you sort of talked there about that element of preparation, but to your point, that was a very clear event. And no, like it was a very, very likely event. It was something where there would be very structured communications to follow, and a lot of that obviously would be guided by whatever else was happening in the world as well. Is there any examples you've got where maybe some organizations just having gone through the steps you talked about, having the crisis communication plan, having that group of individuals that meets regularly, um, and all the preparation activities that I'd be advocating as much as you are, um, has actually helped them be better prepared and changed the outcome when they've dealt with either bad PR or a disruption that's really impacted their brand?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few that come to mind. I mean, there's some where are gonna be coming down the line, which is, I
Mhm.
suppose, a bit of an unusual sometimes situation. So, for example, I've worked in an organisation where we knew there was going to be mass redundancies and a mass restructuring program, and we
Yeah.
knew it was gonna land badly externally because they are a very famous business who are well loved,
Mhm.
and are a bellwether, and people look up to them.
Okay.
So we kind of knew what was going to happen. So we knew both externally we're going to have a bit of a rough ride. Internally, also probably going to get a bit of a rough ride because ultimately some people are going to lose their jobs. So I think having as much preparation we did have, actually, we had a good few weeks actually to prepare.
Right.
Um, Definitely helped. Obviously, you can't mitigate everything that comes your way, and you have to sometimes just accept that you're never going to get it 100% right,
Mm.
despite all the preparation in the world, and that's also fine, I think. But then there are also scenarios, as you know, that come unexpected that really test your plans. So things like product recalls. I've also been in those
Okay.
scenarios
Yeah.
where production has completely had to stop on a particular product because of a fault, and quite a potentially serious fault where there's health ramifications if the production continues until they've worked out what's gone wrong in the production process. So that kind of stuff, I think, once you go through one product recall, I think it brings out quite a lot of interesting information as to kind of how do we prevent this from happening again. It gives you a chance to review your processes,
Yeah.
review what worked, what didn't work. Did we have the right people around the table again? And, yes, the product recall could happen again, but at least hopefully you've learnt from the previous one, which is always a good thing because you're always learning, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, it's that element of, even if it's not a product recall, there'll be some similar elements that can be applied to any of the kind of future disruptions that you would deal with. And similarly to your example of dealing with having to manage reputation when you are doing a planned organizational restructure, the principles are very different, but actually, or can be different, but a lot of the basis of preparing your organization, having clear lines to take, having people understand who are the spokespersons, who are the individuals that can lead this. And then, to your point earlier about, what are our messages, and making sure there's consistency between what we're saying externally, if we have to talk about this externally, which in some cases you would, and what we're saying internally as to the rationale behind this. Because again, that just it provides that kind of reassurance to everybody, I think, because one, it feels like you're not saying different things, and two, and it's factual, you're not saying different things, but two, it just is okay. There's just a like a rhythm of the message we're sharing, the way we're sharing it, how we're doing it, that builds trust in you as an organization, and builds trust in the way you would deal with future kind of events as well.
Absolutely. And I think kind of sort of connected to that is I think it's okay sometimes to say if you don't always have the answer.
Mm.
Like if a staff member asks you a tricky question or if a journalist asks you a tricky question, I don't think it's an absolute boo-boo if you say, I'm sorry, I just don't have that answer to
Mm.
hand right now, but I will absolutely go away and find out for you and come back
Yeah.
as soon as possible. Because when things are fast moving, how of course would you possibly have every answer to every question? You
Yeah.
just wouldn't, because that's the nature of the issue that you're dealing with. You're literally trying to grab all the facts as quickly as possible, and not
Mm.
everyone has them to hand. So I think, you know, people would be much more accepting of your message, I think, if you can't hold your hands up sometimes and say, I'm sorry, I just don't have the answer right now, rather than trying to fudge it or potentially tell an untruth that then lands you in
Yeah.
hot water. So,
Yeah. 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 I think that's, again, it's a really important thing because, again, it's just about being confident in that. Because I think, again, I've worked with different crisis communications teams, PR teams across the years, and spokespersons for organizations. And there is always that sense of, I must have all the information, I must have all the answers. Yet we're living in an imperfect world. You're dealing with another bit of uncertainty on top of the fact that we live in a very imperfect world where this information isn't available. But there is that sense of, I guess, us as individuals and organizations and the media as the wider thing sort of going, well, we need this now. We need certainty because what we're dealing with is really uncomfortable. And that's, again, something I talk about in other places. That's what, to me, resilience is about, is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's a really hard skill for anybody to deal with. And I think this is part of that, is, being comfortable with, I don't know everything right now, but I'm talking to you. I'm not sitting in a room locked away because I don't know everything. I want to have the conversation and I want to be as open as I can with you because that's who I am. That's my organization. And I think that's sort of part of this kind of building that right capability in the organization.
yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to that trust point earlier as well, is that if you're seen to be invisible and trying to help or give as much information as you can, even if you don't know all the answers, people will go away and respect you more for it.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it's a hard balancing act. I completely get that. But I think 99% of the time people will feel better that you tried than you didn't try at all.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, it's that sort of almost that kind of old statement, but it is, like, absolutely true. The worst thing in the world is to stay silent on any situation like this, because, again, people will talk on your behalf if you don't. If you are able just to stand up in front of whatever that audience is and say, something's happened, we don't have all the information right now. We are trying to find out all the information. It comes back to some of the, the really good examples of media management that get discussed are the organizations that do that. We're not hiding. We're not waiting until we have everything. We're telling you something's wrong. And we're telling you we don't have all the information. But we are trying our best to find out all the information, and we will keep you updated and we will share more when we can. And I think that's sort of that really important piece.
Absolutely, yeah. And
Yeah.
do you know what? There's even examples out there where organizations have actually done better on the back of a crisis. I mean,
Yeah.
again, that's not the intention, but
Mm.
like if you use the example of KFC when they ran out of chicken, bizarre because that's their whole business model. Like, how can you run out of chicken? But they changed suppliers and they changed processes, and that's what happened. And then, they just held their hands up and then did a really funny
Mm.
advert, paid for a lot of print advertising, and changed the words of KFC to the other way around to almost allude to a rude word, which we won't say on this podcast, obviously. But I think you can work out what it is.
Yeah.
And, they just sort of made a little bit of tongue in cheek on it, even though they knew obviously it was serious, that they couldn't open for business basically, and they were going to lose some money obviously from it. But, they ended up, the public kind of liked them for it, that they were sort of, holding their hands up. They took the flack, they laughed about it a bit,
Mm.
and then they won loads of awards off the back of it, which is bizarre because that again wasn't the intention, but I think people realized that they handled that crisis really well. So
Yeah.
you know
Yeah. I think it's a really good example, and I think it's exactly that. Yes, you're not doing it for that reason, but if you do manage communications well, you will be seen better. Your organization will be seen in a more positive light, and that can position you in a better way against your competitors. It's a bit like you talked about earlier. It's not about necessarily taking advantage, but if you are able to deal with things in a more proactive way, you will be in a better position and you will come out of any disruptive event in a more prepared and sort of forward-facing way than any of your competitors. And it can be, it could be the boon that you need to build your business going forward. which is a really good way to kind of sort of summarize things. We're sort of heading towards wrapping up now, Sarah. So I was just, if there is one action that people listening to this should be taking to strengthen their communications resilience, what would you recommend?
So preparation, obviously. So hopefully you've got that by now. I think also related to that is don't ever forget about the wash up meeting. So when a crisis, when issues happened, don't just like pat yourself on the back if by chance it went okay. Like there's always stuff to learn.
Yeah.
And I think in the unfortunate event that this might happen again, you're going to absolutely have to kind of learn about what went well and what didn't go well. So I think always make sure you reflect and evaluate what went well and what didn't. And then finally, just as I've mentioned before, is always keep your comms team close by. Like, don't, I've also been sadly in these situations where don't tell them mistruths because that makes our lives harder and also makes the business's life harder. Like, you've got to tell us the truth. If you did something wrong and the process didn't work, hold your hands up and admit to that. And then we can help craft that message to kind of reflect that. But all the while you don't tell us the full facts, it just makes our lives harder and it makes us look a bit stupid if the journalist then finds out about that and they know more than we do. So yeah, I think those would be my key like little nuggets to take away.
Fantastic. Thank you. And for those listening, ask yourself one question. If our story broke tomorrow, do we know who speaks, what matters, and what we stand for? If you haven't got an immediate answer to those questions, that's your signal to plan and prepare because you need to come up with those answers. That's what will help you deal with these kind of disruptions. Sarah, thank you. That was a really good overview of PR and some really good valuable information for people as they're starting to think about this. Where can people learn a bit more about you and connect with you to learn more about your business?
So yeah, you're welcome. So yeah, go on purelypublicrelations.com. So there's quite a useful blog section on there, which I give lots of tips and tricks for free on different PR scenarios. But also probably most relevant to this is I do offer comms training. So whether that's crisis comms training or media training for interview techniques, you don't need to be a client to book those training sessions. So if you feel like that's helpful, feel free to connect with me. I'm also on Instagram, so at @purely_PR, and on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. So again, connect with me and yeah, hopefully we won't have to deal with too many crises, but I'm more than happy to help as and when.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Really, really helpful. And thank you for listening to The Prepared Leader, because resilience isn't built in the moment of crisis, it's built in the decisions we make long before it arrives. Until next time, stay prepared and lead with confidence.